Milestone One. This content will be recorded and made available in an accessible alternative format upon request. If you require captioning, transcription, or other communication services to access this content, please contact the Disability Resource Center at drc@snhu.edu or 877-591-4723, selecting option 4. Today we're going to talk about Milestone One. In this paper you will summarize the 3 articles in the 1 category you have selected. Looking at this folder, you should have seen something similar when you downloaded the articles. These initial folders are the categories. So here we have a selection of employee motivation, parent influence on student achievement, and prescription drug abuse. Depending on the semester, you may have slightly different options, but the topics will always be indicated by the folder titles. Pick one of these, and then you must review all 3 articles within the categories. You cannot pick and choose articles between categories. Once you have your articles selected, read them. You should probably read them 2 to 3 times before you begin writing. Research articles are dense, so the more you give yourself time to read and process, the easier the actual writing should go. Now I'm going to walk you through reviewing one article. Because I do not want to put you in a position where you might accidentally plagiarize me, I have selected an article that is not on any of the current list. This means you will have to think about how my review of my article would look for your article. You should not get the same answers that I do because it will be a different article. Here is the citation for the article. If you have the time and inclination, you might go skim the article before moving on to the next section. You can pause the video here if you'd like. Now that I have my article selected, again, you will select a topic which will have 3 articles. The first thing that I need to do is write up a little introduction to the paper. These introductions should be broad, rather generic sentences that orient the reader to what the paper will be about rather than immediately diving into the material. Note, in science, part of being skeptical is backing up your facts with scientific research. So if I wanted to write, disabilities are increasingly common in the U.S., I would need to find some research to support that and cite that accordingly. If I cannot find any research to support it, or if the research actually indicates that I'm wrong, I should either soften the language to indicate that it's not a fact or take it out altogether. You do not have to start with additional research though. You can simply frame your introduction as more general information and go from there. I might say this instead. Note, I'm not going to be reading the paragraphs to you today, but I do suggest that you pause the video and read them yourself. Note that valuable could be interpreted as a fact and as something I needed to cite, but I think that it's generic enough that I'm okay with not citing it. Think about presenting information to a group of people. If you think it is all possible that they might disagree with you, you should cite it. I don't think people would argue that participation is a good thing, though. The last sentence is a good one because it moves us to the actual topic of the paper while still remaining relatively generic. One thing you want to avoid in an introduction is making it a personal narrative. While you may have picked a category because it personally influences you in some way, that really isn't a good introduction. The point is to tell the reader why the topic should be important to them, and they may not relate well necessarily to your personal story. We might want to flesh this out a little more, but it's good for now, so moving on to the next. Next, we want to introduce the article itself. This orients the reader to the specific article that you are reviewing. So you might say this, citing appropriately at the end of the sentence. Or you could do an in-narrative cite where you include the verbiage of the cite within the context of the sentence itself. Either is fine, and mixing them up occasionally gives your reader some variety. Note that the APA varies the format of the cites by how many authors there are. In this case, we fall within the 3 to 5 authors category, so I will fully list out all authors the first time I cite them, and then use the first author plus et al. In subsequent cites. This can then transition directly into the hypothesis statement. If you had a chance to read through the paper, you'll see that they have never actually stated their hypothesis. However, they do give us these research questions. We know how to craft a hypothesis from a question, so let's do that. Note that there is a little ambiguity here. The article doesn't actually give us a direction for the prediction. I think that you can tell where the author is going, but there is certainly the possibility that I'm incorrect. and reviewing your own articles, don't worry so much about making sure that you've interpreted the hypothesis exactly as intended. Instead, make sure that it is a well-crafted hypothesis that is specific and measurable, containing a prediction. As you move through the paper, make sure that everything you do is interpreted in the same light as you have framed this hypothesis. Given the hypothesis here, I want to make sure that my methods will describe an accurate way of measuring that, and that my results and hypothesis support statement also line up exactly with the direction chosen. If I say that my answers will correlate and the data shows little correlation, I must reject the hypothesis. Note, if your chosen articles spell out the hypotheses for you, you must paraphrase them. It is not sufficient to simply copy-paste somebody else's work. You have to show that you understand it, and paraphrasing is a good way of doing that. Before moving out of this section, I would suggest going ahead and identifying your variables. There are magic words here. You must absolutely use the words independent variable and dependent variable. You should also match your hypothesis, you should also match your variables to the hypotheses given. So for the hypothesis 1 above, I would say this, or I have seen students write their original hypothesis so that it also contains the labels. For example, something like this. If you choose this method and make sure your labels are very clear, you do not need to write an additional sentence. Either option is fine, or you may have some creative options of your own. Just make sure you're using the magic words and linking them to the specific hypothesis. It is not sufficient to simply give a list of independent and dependent variables without telling the reader how each maps onto the hypothesis. Next, we need to move on to methods. There are two key parts to the methods. First is the participant selection. Who actually participated is so important to how we interpret the results, so that needs to be available to your reader. The second is a high-level overview of what they actually did. So for my participant selection, let's try something like this. That is probably the most amount of detail I will put in this milestone. Again, participant selection is very important to how we interpret results. And for an overview of what they did, let's try this. Note that I did not cover every single detail that was in the paper in either section. If somebody wants a word-by-word of what they did, they can read the original article. However, I have conveyed enough information so that the reader can make an informed decision about what the results mean and if the conclusion that the author drew was valid. If in doubt, more is better than less, but learning how to distill down to the important parts is a valuable skill that you should practice throughout the program. Next, we move on to discussing the results. Some of the articles have rather complex statistics. This is not a statistics class, and it is recognized that some of you may not have even had statistics yet, so don't feel like you need to go in depth on the math. Just sketch out what the study found in plain English. This is short and sweet, but covers the primary findings of interest. If you read through the article, you will find that there are entire sections about the actual participation scores and how well the people were integrated into the community. Because that data was not related to our primary hypothesis, I did not cover that. It's interesting, but it's not necessarily relevant to our paper. Notice that I also covered the rubric item overview support in my initial sentence. Students tend to miss this rubric item because it can be so quick and really so obvious given the results. However, it's worth 13% of your grade, so you don't want to skip past that. Last section, the conclusion. The conclusion is not simply a restatement of the results. You've already covered that. Instead, a conclusion should talk about at least one of the following: limitations of the study, implications for the larger population given these results, or directions for future research. This is the step where authors move beyond what they just did and towards the bigger picture. Note that at this point, all you're being asked to do is summarize the author's point of view. You'll get your chance to add your opinion in Milestone 2. So there we go. That's a solid draft. Let's circle back through though and make sure that the flow I mentioned in the beginning is there. The hypotheses talk about the instrument and the correlation between both time and groups. The methods talk about using the instrument over time and between groups. The results talk about the correlation of the scores on the instrument over time and between groups. And the conclusion talks a little bit about overtime. This is a bit off flow, but as we're limited in summarizing what the author said, the conclusions may have to go a little off topic. The important thread is hypotheses to methods to results. If my methods had instead only talked about participation in the community and not how the tool is being used to measure that participation, that would be a red flag because it does not contain the key theme. Note, it's okay to have more than the one key theme if you feel like that's useful, but you should at minimum contain one key theme. A well-written paper will hang together beautifully with the hypotheses determining the key theme. Make sure you check your paper at the end to make sure everything that you're describing in the article fits together well. For this example, we finished the narrative. Of course, for your paper, you'll circle back and do the same thing twice more, covering a total of 3 articles. Once the narrative is complete, let's circle back and add in the title page and reference list. Note that the title page contains the relevant information centered roughly in the middle of the page and is in Times New Roman size 12 font. The biggest mistake I see here is students using colors and different fonts to make the page attractive. It's nice to look at, but it doesn't meet the APA rules, and so it costs the student points. So long as we're here, let's add in the running head as well. If you're in Word, click on Insert, Header, select Blank, and then add in your page number before closing the windows out. This will automatically copy itself to every page. Then we finish with the reference list. Make sure that it's on its own page by adding a page break, title it, and add your references in. Anything that you have cited in your narrative must be here. There are incredibly nitpicky rules about how things have to be listed, and it varies depending on exactly what you're citing. An article will look different from a book, and a book will look different from a website. See your APA manual for specific instructions or check out the Purdue OWL website for a quick overview. You are graded on the details here, so if you have any questions about how your references should be formatted, make sure to talk to your instructor. Here is my reference. Again, I only have 1, but you'll have 3. A couple of final thoughts on formatting. Try to keep it to 1 thought per paragraph. That is, put the hypotheses and maybe the variables in 1 paragraph, but start a new paragraph when you switch to discussing the methods. If you're attempting to do 1 paragraph per article, it becomes too overwhelming and you can easily miss the required information. Second, cite appropriately. If you're discussing an article, it needs to be cited. Instructors will vary a little on how often you should cite, but once per paragraph is a good minimum to shoot for. If you're discussing more than 1 article in a paragraph, of course you need to cite more often to make that transition clear. Finally, don't get too caught up in page counts. The estimates of 2 to 3 pages have proven to be typically too short. Take the space that you need to complete the assignment.